All right, students, are you ready for part 2? This corresponds to chapter 6 of your textbook, and we're going to be getting into morphology now. I want to thank previous teachers from San Diego State School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Science for their assistance on some of these slides. Let's begin by taking a look at this. If you guys are familiar with Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, this should be familiar to you. This is an excerpt from a poem called The Jabberwocky. It reads, "'Twas brillig and the slithy tove did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves and the mome raths outgrabe." So this sounds at one level nonsensical because it has lots of words that we don't readily have a meaning for. But at the same time, we're able to collect a lot of information and actually make pretty decent sense of what this is supposed to mean. The type of information that we're able to derive from this that we're going to focus on today, namely, is that how do we know, for example, that a word like brillig is meant to describe something? It's an adjective, and tove is a noun. They rhyme with lots of words, like tove could be rhymes with dove, but we don't interpret that as a verb in this context. So why is that? And that's a question we're going to try to answer today. Here's more specifically our objectives. We're going to aim to get some definitions, working definitions for the terms morpheme and morphology. We're going to distinguish a variety of different types of morphemes, and then we're going to work through various types of morphemes. Morphology can be defined as the study of the structure of words and the word formation process. We were studying word formation process in the first part of this lecture as well, and now we're going to get into it in a little bit more detail. And as we're kind of going through this class, we're seeing that we have lots of different types of information when it comes to language. Namely, we know something about the sounds of our language. That falls under the umbrella of phonology. And we also know something about the structure of words, the sort of pieces that go together to make a word, and that falls under morphology, what we're focused on today. Next week, we're going to be looking more closely at these remaining two subsections of language, syntax and semantics. All right, let's try to get a working definition for morphology and a morpheme. We can safely say that a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. It is a minimal unit that can have a dictionary meaning and a grammatical meaning. It generally has a constant meaning and definite structure most of the time. And every word has got to have at least one of these morphemes. This is going to be our really key diagram for this unit. So if you can study this diagram and you have a good sense of what each of these nodes means and can get a good working definition or an example from each, you're going to be in great shape. So let's take some time and break this down. We're going to start by distinguishing between two large classes of morphemes, free versus bound. Free morphemes are those that can stand by themselves as single words, and there's two types of these, lexical and functional. Two examples of lexical morphemes are the words mother and shout. These are words that have content or meaning in themselves, and functional morphemes are those like conjunctions and prepositions, so if, and, or, words like that, and they're sort of the little helping chains in a sentence, but they don't carry content. Bound morphemes cannot stand by themselves, so these are things that have to be attached to or affixed, think of the words prefix, suffix, that's where affix is coming from, to some other word. And within bound morphemes, there's two types of these, derivational and inflectional. So we can take our lexical morphemes, mother and shout, and then we can add on some derivational and inflectional morphemes. Okay, now let's take a moment and we're going to work at this top part of this tree, and we're going to focus on lexical versus functional morphemes. Lexical morphemes, as I stated just now, they have meaning in themselves and they carry the content. They're sort of the motor of our message machines. And this is called an open class of words. So this means that we can come up with new ones of these as we showed in the first part of this lecture, that we're doing this all the time. So when we come up with new words, those would always be in the category of open class or lexical morphemes. Functional morphemes don't have a meaning in themselves, but they help us understand how lexical morphemes relate to one another. So these are these sort of little bits, little helpers, conjunctions, and, or, if, but, he, she, and so on. This is called a closed class of words, so we are not really ever coming up with new ones of these. We're pretty good with the ones we have. They do the job, and we don't generally need to come up with new ones, so we refer to those as a closed class. Alrighty, so now we've gotten through lexical and functional, our two free morphemes. Let's take a look at these and try to distinguish between these two types of bound morphemes. Derivational morphemes, this is the same sense of derived as we saw in chapter 5. So they change the grammatical category of a word when we add them to an existing morpheme or stem. Here's just a few examples. We can add ish, and it changes a noun into an adjective. Fool is a noun. Foolish describes someone with a certain quality. It's an adjective. And they can also change the meaning of a word. So we can add un, re, or in to stems, and it makes the stem have a new meaning. Alrighty, here's just another look at derivational morphology. The word derivational in itself is a good example of this. So to derive is a verb. When we add this ending, ation, it makes it a noun, and then we add this other ending to it, al, and it makes it an adjective. The most basic morpheme in the word is going to be its root or its stem, so that would be the verb derive. Here's another look at how we can get from a base form to a variety of derived forms. And then there's also this thing which is called zero derivation. So in some cases, we don't actually add something that you can hear, but we can still change the part of speech. Alrighty, let's take a look at another type of derivational morpheme, this ending able. So this is a case where you actually, again, you change the category of a word, the part of speech. So when we add able, that makes a verb into an adjective. And it also changes the meaning of it. So when we add able to something, it means that something is basically able to be whatever the verb is, right? But I want to point out some exceptions here. So if you think about it, readable doesn't necessarily mean able to be read. It more roughly means that something is well written, or it can be used in that sense. Washable doesn't necessarily mean it's able to be washed. We usually use that to mean that certain fabrics can be put through the washing machine. Another example is comparable, which doesn't really mean it's able to be compared. It actually means something more like something is roughly the same as something else. That's something that we can refer to as semantic drift. So we have this slight change, and that's a term that we can use to describe that. So here are three things that are going on when we use this derivational morpheme able. But let's go deeper into this. There's actually certain cases when we can't add able to a word. Let's take a look and see if we can figure out how. Alright, if we want to express the idea that humans don't live forever, we can't say that humans are dieable. That definitely doesn't sound right. Let's compare words that seem like they're good candidates for taking able, and then verbs that are bad candidates, and let's see if we can figure it out. So on the left here, all of these are pretty good, right? We can add able to all of them. They sound good. And then the ones on the right sound pretty weird. We wouldn't say something's weepable. So why not, though? Here's the difference, guys. The verbs on the left side are a certain type of verb. We're going to get more into this in syntax, but basically they're all transitive verbs, and the verbs on the right are all intransitive verbs. Transitive verbs are those that take an object phrase. So you can read something, an object, a noun. You can break something, an object, a noun. But notice that the intransitive verbs, they don't need to take an object. You don't have to sleep a bed. You don't have to You can run a mile, but you could just run, right? It doesn't need to have an object to be grammatical. So that's the key difference between these two lists. See how read, break, and wash can all take an object? Jesse read the book, Kenny broke the dish, Jake washed his clothes. Those are all the object noun phrases. And then here's pairs, right, that are intransitive. So Jesse slept, Kenny cried, Jake died. They don't need to have an object after the verb. Here's some more example. Here's the verb walked, where it takes an object. Maddie walked, and then the object is the dog. So we could also say that the dog is walkable, right? It's a transitive verb. We can add able to it. And the same for Kevin ran the race. The race is runnable. So let's try to articulate this rule. What's going on with able? Well, when it's attached to a base, the pronunciation changes. We see this phonological change that's undergone. And it also undergoes this category change. So when we add it to a transitive verb, it makes it into an adjective. And then it also changes the meaning, right? It means that something's roughly able to be verbed. So those are derivational morphemes. Let's get to our last category, inflectional, which is a type of bound morpheme. Alrighty, these guys, inflectional morphemes, they don't change the grammatical category of the stem they're added to, and that's really the big distinguishing feature between inflectional versus derivational morphemes. They also don't make new words, they add information to an existing word. In English, these are always at the end of a word, they're suffixes, and we have 8. Let's take a look at these 8. They are plural s, possessive s. We have those are for nouns. The next 2 are for adjectives. Comparative, where we add er or est. Est is the superlative marker. And then we have the remaining 4 are all inflectional morphemes that we add onto verbs. And these are used to mark tense and agreement. So let's make sure we know the difference between these two types. Inflectional affixes don't change the category, the part of speech of the base word. And they also are used largely to indicate certain grammatical functions, like if something is plural, the tense that we're speaking in, and agreeing with other syntactic elements of the sentence. Derivational affixes, for the most part, do change the category of the base word. And there's another rule operating for inflectional and derivational morphemes, and that's the order that they have to be added to a stem in. So inflectional suffixes always have to come after derivational ones. We can't say moderns eyes, we have to say modernizes. So once we get to that inflectional suffix, that's the one that has to be the very end, then we can't add anything else to it. And it's also the case that certain derivational affixes make new base forms or new stems. So depending on the way we're looking at a word, if we add the er derivational suffix to the verb to write to form the stem writer, then that's the new base form. And then we can add an inflectional morpheme onto that, the possessive or plural, to form writers. Okay, let's return to our working definition. We're calling a morpheme a minimal unit of meaning that's associated with a particular form, or a minimal unit with a more or less constant meaning associated with a more or less constant form. So we have our base form dog. We can add our morpheme s to form the plural, where dog is the stem and s is the affix, which in this case is a suffix because it comes at the end. Dog is a free morpheme, it's a lexical morpheme, and s is a bound morpheme. And affixes can be either at the beginning of the word, at the end of a word, or in the middle of the word. And as you're seeing here, we have prefix and suffix affixes in English, but we don't have very many infixed ones. Let's work through some examples from other languages. In this example from a Nigerian language, we see that we have the words for excellent, big, and small on the left side, and then we have the words for excellence, bigness, and smallness. So what can we say about these two columns? Well, the left side, these are all nouns, and the right side, those are all adjectives. And then what do we see also that's different about them? Well, it looks like the left side doesn't have this prefix NEM, and then the right side does, but then the rest of it looks the same. So I think what we can guess about this is that NEM is a derivational morpheme, and it's used to derive nouns from adjectives. Here's an example from a Ugandan language. And we see on the left-hand side we have singular nouns, and on the right-hand side we have plural nouns. On the left side we see that they're prefixed by this sound OMU, and on the right side they're prefixed by ABA. So in this case, we see that there's an inflectional prefix, omu, that's used with singular nouns, and a different inflectional prefix that's used for plural nouns. It's kind of cool. We don't have that in English. Here's an example from a language spoken in the Philippines. And this is also really neat and unique from English, where you have the stem forms, and what we see is that in the plural form on the right-hand side, the first part of the singular form is just doubled up, and this is a process called reduplication. So to form the plural in Ilocano, you take the first part of the singular form and repeat it. Alrighty, let's finish up by looking at an interesting test case, just something to think about. We described morphemes as the smallest possible unit of meaning, but what about expressions like this, idioms? To kick the bucket. But kick the bucket means to die. It doesn't mean to actually kick a bucket. We want to call kick the bucket a single morpheme? Just something to think about. Here's another case to think about. So say we want to add the same added morphological information to a variety of nouns. Let's take a look at how that will look. So we have cat, bus, sheep, and we want to make them all more than one. And that would look like this. For cat, we would just add S. For bus, we would have to add ES. And then for sheep, we wouldn't add anything at all. So this is just to point out that we can have the plural morpheme, but it's not always going to take the surface form of just the single letter S. So just something to be aware of. We call these different surface realizations of a single morpheme allomorphs. I've included a practice exercise for you guys just to go through the following 8 words and have that diagram handy. And just try to go through and figure out of these 8 words, are they bound or free? Are they derivational or inflectional morphemes? And are they the base or the affix? And then I want you to indicate how many morphemes are in each word. So spoiler alert, I'm including the answers on the next slide. So if you want to work through this and you don't want to look at the answers now, pause the video. And when you're ready to see the answers, you can go ahead and pause this slide. Thanks for listening, and good luck on your quiz this week.